One of my favorite quotes from the comics is with great power comes great responsibility. Has it ever occurred to you that as an author, you have great power? Sometimes for the good, sometimes for the bad. It's how you leverage that power. So that got me thinking, maybe authors should sometimes have a moment or two to start thinking about what their sacred duty is, what their great responsibility is. And that's what this episode of The Author Switch is going to be about. It's going to be about the ethics behind being an author and what the custodial responsibility that you have as an author, even if all you're doing is writing a book to grow your business.
Are you an entrepreneur, small business owner, or consultant looking to boost your authority, influence, and impact? The Author Switch podcast with best selling, award winning author Carma Spence is your answer. Tune in for actionable advice, powerful strategies, and engaging interviews to turn on your author switch and take your business to the next dimension.
The Author Switch.
Hello, and welcome back to the Author Switch podcast. I am your host, Carma Spence, and I help entrepreneurs leverage the power of books to grow their business. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about how authors are guardians of culture, of information, of wisdom, and how it is our responsibility as authors to wield our great power with great responsibility. First, I want to just talk a little bit about the guardian role that we have as authors. Our works, because they encapsulate our information, our wisdom in a moment in time, they're like time capsules. And no matter how hard you want to be evergreen or base your content in universal principles that will last forever, you can't help but incorporate your cultural lens, seeing those universal principles. And so it kind of behooves you to take a moment to be aware of that natural bias. We all have it. We all have biases. I mean, are they good biases, bad biases, neutral biases? We all have them. They exist because we are human, and that is part of human nature. Books serve as a powerful, powerful tool for education, and how we frame the information we put into our books can impact how that information is perceived. Now, most business books are fairly neutral, but not all of them. Read any of the long-lasting ones. There's usually an underlying principle. How you couch your information in your book communicates something more than just that information. It communicates sort of a cultural milieu of where you are and your particular culture, but it also says something about the greater culture. So, for example, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. Yes, the principles in that book, they're just as valid today as they were back when he wrote that book. But if you read the book, you can also see how it is a little reflection of the time in which Napoleon Hill was writing. He bridges the gap between his past and his present by sharing these timeless principles of success. And he includes stories of historical figures like Thomas Edison and Henry Ford, making their success strategies relevant to contemporary readers. But that's contemporary readers to his time. In his time, they weren't historical figures. So, I mean, they were clearly going to be, but they were still alive. He could talk to them. But now that book is a piece of history. So when you create your book, you're creating a little time capsule that can communicate the times in which you lived and wrote to future generations. Hill's book also is based on a 20-year study of successful people providing an authentic, real life experiences that add credibility and depth to his narrative. But they also, because they were there, they also tell us a little bit about the time and the history. So when you are creating your book, the people you talk to, the case studies you do, the interviews you do, all the things that go into your book communicate this cultural heritage. Think and Grow Rich has inspired countless entrepreneurs and leaders across generations and across time, encouraging them to adopt the principles and achieve their own success. And that's what makes it so almost evergreen, despite the fact that it's very rooted in its time. So that's how we are guardians and custodians of our time, our history, our wisdom. But there's also, dare I say, a sacred duty aspect to this because authors have a sacred duty in preserving timeless wisdom and cultural knowledge. And we do that even if we are doing it unconsciously. Entrepreneurial authors are educators and informers. They relate their information, their wisdom to readers, thus teaching the next generation of whatever topic you cover and fostering understanding and appreciation of these things. So, for example, books that explain cultural practices, values, histories, bridge gaps between different cultures. Maybe your book does that, maybe it doesn't. But I want you to think of culture in a little bit broader terms than what most people do. I mean, initially my knee-jerk reaction to saying cultural heritage is usually along the lines of like, I'm half Spanish. So, I mean, literally, my grandparents came over from Spain, Spanish. And do I have a duty to share the Spanish heritage that I had in my books? And I probably do, just because I was so, I mean, it was just such an intense part of my life. But that's not what I'm getting at here because business has its own culture too. That's outside of our ancestry. And we have a responsibility to share that culture as well. So Think and Grow Rich shared part of the culture that was the people he was interviewing had a culture that I don't know if it still exists today because business is so different today. And yet there's probably parts of it that are absolutely the same. Authors can be guardians of heritage. Like I just said, I could be passing on my heritage. My father was more of a a mutt, a mixed breed, but there's a lot of Scottish was in there. Funny story on that one. I grew up with the day before, basically Christmas Eve was Gingerbread Man Day. And for years and years growing up, I totally thought that this was some Scottish cultural thing that my father was passing down. No, no, it wasn't. Turns out my grandfather, who I never met because he died before I was born, he just really loved gingerbread men, and so he made up the holiday so that he could have an excuse to have gingerbread man every year, and then my father passed it on, and then recently I discovered my cousins don't even know about this. So, like, apparently this this tradition really made an impact on my father, and so he passed it on to me, and it's made an impact on me, but his brothers did not pass it on to their children. Interesting, interesting. I think that's interesting. Anyway, authors are also chroniclers of change. Change in business practices, change in marketing practices. For example, I recently read a book by Mark Schaefer that is about building community and having a community-based business. Now, those communities were not easy to create before online. Having our business be online has radically changed the culture of business. More people are able to get into business that may never have been able to get into business before. And how we go about creating and nurturing our audience and our business has radically changed. So, as authors, we can document that change and how it affects our unique corner of the business world with our books. Authors are builders of legacy. If you play your cards right and write a book that makes an impact, you are also creating a legacy. When you create your book, you are creating a work that can become a part of a larger cultural legacy or a smaller microcosm of cultural legacy. Classic literature and the seminal works of Napoleon Hill and other authors have become classics because they captured that essence. And you can do that in your book as well. Another great responsibility that authors have is being a catalyst for dialogue. So, for example, Quiet, the book that was all about how introverts can be valued members of the workforce, even though we tend to be kind of quiet and we're not in your face. Okay, that was a bias. I just said you're in your face like an extrovert because as an introvert, extroverts often come off as kind of being in your face, but they're just being who they naturally are. So you just cut myself there. Mm. Anyway, like writing that book, the author created a dialogue that has I mean, since that book, more books are coming out about being an introvert, and there's entire businesses that are out there to help introverts step out into their roles in the workforce and in their business and be more successful in this loud world, to use her term. So, by writing your book, you could be starting a dialogue about a topic that isn't currently being talked about, and that makes an impact. Authors are inspirers of action. All sorts of actions have been taken because of books, whether the author intended them or not. So if you can be more mindful of what you're putting into your book and I mean, I remember reading, there's a book that's all about story. And in the book, he talks a little bit how Hitler was greatly inspired by this one book, and I had it a moment ago. Anyway, it wasn't a book that you'd think would cause someone to go and kill a bunch of people, but it did. It was not the author's intention. So, our words inspire actions. So, be careful what kind of action you're implying with your books, because that's a great responsibility. Authors are connectors of generations. How many generations have read Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich? I don't know the math, so I can't tell you. It's a lot. And people are still reading that book today. I have a copy of it, and I've read it at least once. I think I started a second time and then got sidetracked. I think at least once a year, I hear somebody going, "This is a great book, read it." And it keeps coming out with new editions. It's one of the best-selling books in the business world ever, I think. I think I have that information right. Maybe your book won't be like Think and Grow Rich. Okay, let's be real here. Not everyone can write the Think and Grow Rich book, but you can create a book that connects at least 2 generations, maybe 3, because they're all living right now, right now. Authors are curators of knowledge. Libraries are built from books, and each book has knowledge within it, knowledge and wisdom. When you write a book, you are contributing to the greater knowledge of the world, and that is a great responsibility. Authors are transmitters of wisdom. So there's wisdom between your ears. If you're a business owner, if you are an entrepreneur, there is wisdom between your ears. In fact, actually, even if you're not, there is wisdom between your ears because you've lived a certain length of time and learned a few things. Why not pass on that wisdom? Pass it on so that, hey, maybe your kids, your nephews, your nieces, the boy down the street can read it and learn something from your experiences. I personally love working on memoirs because when you learn something about someone through working on their memoir, you're often surprised, pleasantly surprised by the amazingness of what seemed on the outside an ordinary life. When I get my mother talking about some of the experiences she had an amazing life. She really did. I mean, she was a nun for 2 years. She lived in Spain for a while with her family. She had all these adventures, and yet she thinks of herself as being quite ordinary, but she's had an extraordinary life, and you know what? I bet you have too, and I bet you know people who have. You can take those stories and use them to pass on wisdom, pass on knowledge, or just pass on, "I am here." Sometimes it doesn't matter how many people actually read the book. What's more important is the book actually exists. Anyway, God, that almost made me wanna cry. Authors are also encouragers of reflection. I'm reading a book called Divine Dance right now, and I read just tiny sections of it at a time because I'm often reflecting on what the author's talking about. And I found myself reflecting with the fiction as well. Think last year, I read the book version of the Doctor Who episode that was with Marco Polo. The episode itself is lost, but they have a lot of scenes and they have the script and they made a novelization of it. It was awesome, and I often found myself going, "Hmm, that's an interesting thought," or, "Hmm, I wonder if what would" even fiction makes us reflect. So, as an author, you are a reflection encourager. There you go. So, I am now going to take a quick break. When we return, I will be talking about some actionable steps that you can take to be a better steward in your author business.
In a city filled with stories, one author seeks the elusive, the transformative, the right idea. It's not just any idea, it's the one that will change everything. Through twists and turns, through doubts and revelations, the discovery that will elevate the book to the next level. It all starts with an idea by Carma Spence, available now on Amazon.
Hello, and welcome back to the Author Switch podcast. I am your host, Carma Spence. And before the break, I was talking about an author's responsibility because with great power comes great responsibility. And as an author, you wield great power. I talked about our sacred duty and all the different things that we as authors, our roles, the things that we do, such as we're educators and informers, we're guardians of heritage, chroniclers of change, builders of legacy, catalysts for dialogue, and inspirers of action, connectors of generations, curators of knowledge, transmitters of wisdom, and encouragers of reflection. Now, I'd like to go into a little bit about why have I been sharing all this information? Why is it relevant? Why are all these roles that we as authors step into, why are they important? First, let's talk a little bit about preserving historical wisdom. Why is that important? It provides valuable insights into both timeless principles, a la Think and Grow Rich, but it also preserves what's really happening in the current time because, as you may have noticed in the news, there's been some movement to rewrite history. And this is not the only time that's happened. Generations have always gone back and tried to rewrite history, see it through their own lens. But a future lens can interpret things differently than the people who were experiencing that time. And I think that understanding what the people were going through in the time and why they took the actions they took, whether you agree with them or not, is important because if you don't understand your history, you're really doomed to repeat it. And I think that one of the responsibilities we have as authors, and we'll do it whether we take it seriously or not, is documenting what the current culture is, what the current activities are. Part of what we know about all the presidents that I mean, for all the way back to George Washington is because we've had their writings, we have their letters. Some of them wrote books. That's why we know what we know. There was documentation. And if you don't document it, it will get lost. And so that is important. That is an important responsibility. And it's so relevant. It's so relevant because a lot of things that are going on now have happened before. And if we ignore what happened before, bad things could happen now. Our role as authors is important in social cohesion. Understanding and appreciating cultural heritage can enhance social cohesion by fostering a sense of shared identity and belonging. Authors bridge cultural gaps with their works. They promote unity by sharing stories and highlighting common human experiences and values. I remember a while back, I was reading a book that was about Native American myths and legends. And as I was reading it, I mean, it's obviously a very different culture for me. I love reading stuff from other cultures. I love it. It's always fascinating because one thing I have discovered reading how different we are has also really solidified my belief of how the same we all are. We are all human, having human experiences and just expressing it in different colors and different clothing and different things. It's also interesting. I read a lot of science fiction and I've read some Russian science fiction, Japanese science fiction, and Mexican science fiction. And it's what I find very interesting is they're all clearly science fiction. You can see how they can be lumped together into this category called science fiction, and yet they each have their own flavor. It's like it's like a bouquet of flowers. There's the rose smell and the daisy smell and the daffodil smell and the violet smell. They're all flowers, but they all smell different. So, anyway, that's I think by expressing our own unique lens in our books, we help people understand different lenses if they're open to it. Our work is important and relevant because we educate and enhance future generations. For example, can you imagine what the world would be like if Think and Grow Rich had never been written? What would have happened to our history if Frankenstein had never been published? What if Mary Shelley had kept that manuscript squirreled away in a drawer and never published? Can you imagine? Perhaps Boris Karloff would have never become Boris Karloff. I mean, who knows? Who knows? I mean, every book has a ripple effect. It could be a small ripple effect or it could be a big one. You never know. You never know. So get your book out. I'm just saying. Books create context in a fast-paced world. So, for example, Brene Brown has given context through her lens of seeing the world about vulnerability. And the woman who wrote Quiet has put context into what it's like to be an introvert in an extroverted world. These books provide context. They provide a potentially deeper understanding of this one little niche. If you do it right, books can also foster critical thinking. Critical thinking is an important skill because without it, you just accept everything at face value. And by asking questions and providing deep information, you can help foster critical thinking in your industry. Books also, I was kind of hinting at this, but I hadn't quite come out and said it yet, but books record rapidly changing cultures. There are some books, it's like, poof, they come in, they're wonderful, and everybody's, "Ugh," and then the world changes, and suddenly that book's no longer relevant. But it was important because it may have played a catalyst to that change. Crazy, huh? Crazy. Awesome. And finally, being an author is relevant because when you write a book, you change. Writing a book fosters personal development. You learn about yourself, you clarify your ideas. Writing the book that was just advertised in the commercial break, it all starts with an idea. That it explains a framework I've been developing for a few years, and writing the book helped me define it even further. It's like an evolving and as I walk my clients through the process, I'm constantly finding little tweaks to make it better and better, and none of that would have happened if I hadn't written the book. In fact, writing the book that's all about book marketing, writing that book helped me hone years of information about marketing and how to frame it and organize it. I never really put it into the framework that I put in this book before. And so writing the book helped me become better at what I do. Writing your book will help you become better at what you do. So now I just want to share some examples and how these different books illustrate many of the points that I've been talking about. So there's a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, and it shares timeless wisdom. He explores why companies transition from being good to being great, and he distills this wisdom from historical business successes. He preserves key cultural insights from various successful companies and creates a blueprint for lasting excellence. That's timeless wisdom, and he was able to encapsulate it in this book, Good to Great. So now people can read that book and maybe follow the same. Maybe those people went to great just because it just happened. I mean, they were doing the things that they were needed to do, but they didn't know that that's what was leading it. Because he did this meta study of it, now he's been able to give other people the blueprint so that they can go from good to great consciously and on purpose, which may not have been possible before that book. Next book is Start with Why by Simon Sinek. He digs into the fundamental human drive to find meaning and purpose, drawing on examples from successful organizations throughout history. He preserved his cultural insight and applies it to modern business practices. And what's interesting is I've heard some people talk about this book, Start with Why. And remember how I was talking about books can be a catalyst for critical thinking and conversation? I know some people who are now taking that book and going a level deeper. Maybe there's something before the why. You may start with the why, but maybe that's not where it started at all. Blue Ocean Strategy by Chan Kim and Renee, oh my goodness, Mabor? Mabor? I probably should have looked up how to pronounce that. Malbornia? We'll just say W. Chan and Renee. They wrote Blue Ocean Strategy. Now, I have been hearing this ever since that book came out. Almost every big guru talks about the blue ocean, the red ocean, and all those things. And it was pretty much because of this book, because this book integrated some strategic thinking with cultural and economic analysis and showed how businesses can create an uncontested marketplace, a blue ocean, and it preserves that strategic wisdom for future generations. And I mean, I have not read that book yet. But that obviously has impacted a lot of the big thinkers in business today because I'm hearing that term over and over and over again. Here's one you've probably heard of, Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. He basically shared some life lessons that he learned from his rich dad and his poor dad. And he's used that information to become very wealthy himself and shared his knowledge in that book. And in so doing, has shared cultural values, his attitudes towards money, investment, and from these different socioeconomic backgrounds. And he has impacted many lives who have used the information they've learned from that book to become wealthier or at least more abundant and think more abundantly. And then here's one of my favorites. I've read it once and then I lost the book. No, I didn't lose it. I loaned it to a friend who never returned it and I had to buy it again. And that is Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And what I liked about that book, he took these principles for personal and professional effectiveness and he made them okay, here let me go with this thought here. So, highly effective people have certain behaviors that make them highly effective. And by watching them, you can infer what they're doing. But this book took that inference and made it concrete because he studied these different people. He pulled out the through lines from all these case studies, and then he made it cohesive so that you can read that book and you can understand what those 7 habits are and start implementing them in your life. Now, I don't recommend implementing all 7 all at the same time. You'll probably go crazy pants. Implement one until it becomes an ingrained habit, then implement the next one. Get the plate spinning before you add more plates. Just saying. So, how do you do all this stuff that I've been talking about? I'm going to give you about 1 page full of tips. So, first, you can incorporate history into your book by using historical case studies and examples to illustrate your business principles and strategies. How do you do this? You research historical figures who are in some way exemplifying or illuminating or illustrating your points. Dive into their lives and how do they come to manifest this thing, and then use their life as part of your case studies. Integrate cultural practices into your book. And again, it can be corporate culture, workplace culture. Workplace culture is in radical change right now. And there's a lot of angst because before COVID, no one thought twice about going into the office. I mean, yes, there were some rogue people who like, I am a remote worker and I want to be a nomad and all that kind of stuff. But the vast majority of worker bees, worker people going to normal J jobs didn't think twice about going into the office and clocking in. Then COVID happened. And they found that through 2 years of lockdowns, they could do a lot of them, not all, obviously, a lot of them could do their jobs just as well, sometimes even better than when they went into the office. And so now you've got companies who are trying out hybrid moves. They're trying to put the foot down and say, you have to come in the office. And you're getting people leaving jobs. And just there's just all this, the dust is flying. Where it's going to land, I don't know. I highly suspect that we'll probably land in a much more flexible environment. There's always going to be jobs that have to go into the office be- because they can't do it at home. Like, I mean, a nurse cannot work from home unless she's doing telemedicine. But, if someone's bleeding, they need another human being there to stop the bleeding. Just saying. But as a writer, there's absolutely no reason I need to go into an office. Really, no reason at all. Anyway, use authentic storytelling. Tell real stories from your life, real stories from your clients' life, from you working with them, real stories of historical figures. Use storytelling that is, and if for some reason you need to tell a story that's not true, be honest about it. Be honest about it. There have been stories I've told in my books that are not true. And I just say, look, let's say Sarah, not based on any other human. Sarah does this, this, and this. And I use it as an example because sometimes I don't have a real Sarah that will illustrate the example I'm trying to communicate. And that happens. That's okay. Just as long as you're upfront about it, that's fine. And this is interesting. I'm hearing of more and more business books using a fiction format to tell their information. In fact, on this podcast, just a few episodes ago, I interviewed Corey Poirier, and he's written a parable that teaches timeless wisdom. I have a couple of books in my library that are business books that teach business wisdom in a fictional format. And I have a friend who's in the throes right now of writing a fiction book that will explain her methodology. I think is a growing trend. I really do. I would love to help people do that because I think that would be really cool. I think that'd be really cool. Anyway, moving on. Develop educational resources. There's 2 things you can do here. 1, the book itself can be an educational resource, but 2, you can create tangential things to your book that are educational. You can create a companion workbook. You can create cheat sheets and handouts that people can get maybe give you their email address in exchange for said things or not. I mean, I've seen authors do it both ways. I've seen some of them have a resource page. You just go and download the stuff. Mark Schaefer, for example, he's got a page that goes with the book that I was just telling you about, and I will put the book in the show notes. I just can't remember the name of it right now. I'm terrible with this information. Anyway, you go to the resource page, and I'd say about 75% of the stuff on that page you can download without any exchange of email. But there are a few resources on there that are probably a little bit higher perceived value that he does require your email address. So why not? You could do a hybrid model just like Mark Schaefer. Encourage reflection and dialogue. People who do journals or do mindset work almost always do that, but you can do it in your business as well. So, for example, in my book about book marketing, I actually do say, okay, here's the mindset to cultivate. Here's some action steps and some strategies, but I don't prescribe do this thing. I say these are the things I think work the best in this phase, but try everything out, reflect on what works for you, and then I give some pointers on how to frame that reflection. And I do that with my clients as well. It's like, okay, this is the goal you want to achieve. Here's what I think is the quickest path given your situation, but you also have these other options. And I always give my clients the option to travel their author's journey in their most authentic way. I am not the keeper of all information. I am not the keeper of all paths. We all have our own paths, and you need to walk the path that you need to walk. That doesn't mean you can't get help. That doesn't mean you can't get advice, but it is your path and your responsibility. Just saying. Problem solving, you can apply the knowledge and the culture and the history that you've pulled into your book to solve problems and or help people become problem solvers themselves. So for example, the book that is coming out right now, it's looking like it's coming out in September. I really can't push it out much longer because I've already pushed my PR people 3 times as I've pushed the date back on that book. It's all about mindset, author mindset, sometimes called writer's block. And I'm doing a lot of deep research into neuroscience as well as spirituality and psychology and all these disparate things. And I'm using them to express my framework for solving the problem of creative block. But I don't tell you this is the way to solve writer's block. I don't do that because and this is I'm going to get up on my little mini soapbox right now. And that is many people treat writer's block like it is a disease in and of itself, and it is not. Writer's block has more in common with a sneeze than it does a cold. And here's why. Creative blocks are sprung from it is a symptom of something else. It can be a symptom of something small, it can be a symptom of something large. Sometimes it's a symptom of multiple things interacting with each other, and oh boy, that's fun to untangle. But you can't cure your creative block if you do not understand what is causing the creative block. And so when you read articles online, which pisses me off, when you read articles online that says, "Oh, here's a cure for writer's block. Walk around the block a couple of times." That's helpful if and only if the writer's block was created by maybe sore muscles and you just need to move, or maybe you weren't breathing right and you need to exercise. I mean, not all walking around the block is not going to solve a writer's block that's caused by a deep emotional wound. It's not going to solve a writer's block that's caused by a disconnection from God. It is not going to solve a problem that's caused by you not understanding where your book is going, which is a creative problem. It's just not. Walking around the block isn't going to solve those things. So you can't say that is a cure for writer's block. There's multiple cures because there's multiple causes, and that's what this book is about. And so what I'm trying to do with this book is empower my readers to be problem solvers of their own creative blocks. Long story short, short story long. Uh, anyway, and my last tip, document the evolution of your processes. As you're going about creating your frameworks, your unique methodologies, document how they are in every given moment. And then you can look back and see how they evolved over time. It's really interesting for me to look at my first framework for coming up with the idea. What it is now, it's in there, but I had like all this extra stuff because I hadn't figured it out yet. And if you look at Edison, he has all this documentation of all these light bulbs that didn't work. And we all have those processes. This is part of the reason why being an author is an exercise in personal development. So I've gone on much longer than I normally do for an episode. I hope you found some of the things I shared of value, if not all of them. And I hope it gives you some food for thought and that you are able to embrace the great power that you wield as an author. This is the end of the Author Switch podcast. And this is Carma Spence saying, ciao for now. If you've enjoyed this episode of the Author Switch podcast and would like to show your support, there are a few ways that you can do that. First, I encourage you to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Additionally, leaving a rating and review would greatly help me reach more listeners and continue providing valuable content. To stay up to date with the Author Switch podcast and gain access to additional information on amplifying your authority, influence, and thought leadership through books, you can follow me on LinkedIn at Carma Spence. For those interested in catching up on previous episodes, including those no longer available on podcast platforms, you can find them all at authorswitch.com/episodes, where you can choose to watch or listen to them at your convenience. Thank you so much for your support and for being a part of the Author Switch community.